thank you everybody for being here. Thank you very much for inviting me to Notre Dame. And it's been a wonderful, very stimulating day. So get your feet hot for Ukraine, and I'll give you a little bit of a lesson, I think, in terms of academic careers and organizing one's professional development, because Ukraine wasn't something that I thought I was going to be studying. I think I'd been there very briefly on a train ride from Krasnodar to Moscow visiting a friend. Very different times, crossed that border in the middle of the night while asleep. But me studying Ukraine, it's a lesson in contingency and chance, I think, in academia, because I didn't originally study conflict, or at least I didn't think I was studying it when I was a graduate student. I went to West Africa to study agricultural reform, and that was 3 months before the war began in Liberia. And eventually I found I had to negotiate with some armed groups to continue access to my field sites for what was ultimately a really dumb study, and I replaced it with something that had nothing to do with my dissertation proposal. I wrote a dissertation about something entirely different. So that's just a short story to keep your mind open and study real hard, because you don't know what the future is going to be, and you have to adapt. And at this point now, the project I'm going to talk to you about today, it's something that for me is really a change in my career path. But it does have some through lines to the politics of conflict, and one of the things I'm really interested in is how conflict changes organizational cultures and institutions and societies. So if you want to call that political order, it's where does that come from? And I've got a bunch of new people I'm working with. That nice picture. It's like the Ukraine flag, got the sky, and then you got the wheat fields underneath. And if you do the right prompts in the AI, impressionist war in Ukraine, come up with some expressive stuff.
Press the down button.
Press the down button. Oh, that's good. All right. So the project I'm going to talk to you about is foreign military training, an aspect of security force assistance. Why security force assistance? Well, it's a Minerva grant. Department of Defense had a whole bunch of money for it. And we pitched idea to them in 2019. The idea was, the riddle is, where does the institutional capacity of armed forces in security force assistance, in other words, the success cases, where does that come from in societies that have very weak political institutions and are beset by political instability? Because the problem in these places is that usually the governments to whom you're given all these billions of dollars, they want military capacity, but they want our military capacity. They don't want their own military capacity because they're worried it's ultimately going to be used against their government. So that's what we set off to study in 2019. And it was a bunch of work that I'm doing in conjunction with a few active military folks who were in our PhD program and have gone on to academies and war colleges and big places in Washington, D.C. and so forth. So we were going to have ourselves a bit of fun, and that was going to be paid for by Air Force Office of Scientific, overseen by Office of Scientific Research. However, the opinions, findings, conclusions, expressed in stock do not necessarily reflect the views of the United States Air Force. They are ours alone. And what happened was, in studying security force assistance in weak states, there's a problem, there's a selection bias problem in this, and that is that, since we were so smart, we were going to work in Afghanistan, Iraq, Mali, and Niger. So Afghanistan, new management, they weren't interested in our project. Iraq, the Iranian-backed militias turned out to be a problem for us. I worked in Mali, and I met some Russian guys who told us it was time to wrap it up, and there was a coup in Niger. So what do you do when you lose all your case studies and the funder still has a lot of money to give you? What you do is you go to the program manager and you restructure. They're like idiots. Ukraine, security force assistance, that's where
We said, yeah, they got weak state institutions too, and I guess there's a legacy of political instability. So using the baby Russian from way back in my grandma's day and so forth, got a restructure. So what we did was we set out then to study security force assistance to Ukraine, looking at the impact of this on Ukrainian forces. I'm the only civilian in the group, so I'm the guy who always draws the short straw to go to Ukraine. So we're interacting with Ukrainians in at Grafenwehr and in different sites in the UK and so forth as a team, but that somehow, and this is where political science gets real messy, I'm supposed to go to Ukraine and go check it out with these soldiers and see, okay, well, what's the impact of the weapons, the training, the connections, the networks, and so forth that we intentionally or unintentionally gave to these Ukrainians when they're actually in the fight. So reading the crowd here, what I decided to do for this talk is to talk more about that, and we can get into what security force assistance means, what the disjunctures are, which was also very fundamental to the original project, but in a different context now in Ukraine. Part of the issue that we're dealing with in the Ukrainian case is attrition warfare. And in terms of this disjuncture between the principal and the agent, the principal, us, given security force assistance of various forms to Ukrainians, is that we start off with this sort of, I don't know, narcissistic notion about we're going to build a Ukrainian force that looks like the U.S. military. Part of the problem is that for me, observation, once I get to Ukraine, there's a lot of stuff that's happening there in terms of attrition warfare, looking at battles of position where we don't see a whole lot of change of territory really since the beginning of the year. But this is not the assumption upon which security force assistance was given to Ukrainians. Because looking at it from an American perspective, what we're interested in is combined arms maneuver. Because for us, that's how we define success. It's a big military, and it combines all these different domains and all of these different organizations like an orchestra. And the idea is something that I think that the people that designed these programs and the operators thought that they saw in Ukraine last year in 2022, when we did see Ukrainian army moving and pushing Russians out of areas that they had occupied after the full-scale invasion in February of last year. But this is the reality. The other reality in Ukraine that is a disjuncture from a lot of the assumptions of U.S. and NATO partner programs is just simply about the nature of the fight. There's a lot of different statistics about what the casualty rate has been. So you got attritional warfare, not a lot of territorial change in terms of who controls what. But I think talking to a Ukrainian friend the other day, I was telling him about this project, and we were debating how many Ukrainian servicemen had been killed and so forth. He says, look, just simply take a low figure for the Ukrainians, which is that in the last almost 2 years now, there are more Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in conflict, at least by official figures, and I think you could increase it a bit from that, as were killed in 20 years of American war in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Okay, so maybe that's like 10 times worse then, because it's 1/10 of the time. And then you look at it and you say that, Ukraine's about 1/10 of the population of the United States. So that's like 100 times worse. And the rapidity with which this is happening 10 times faster, that's like 1,000 times worse. I mean, in terms of the impact of this conflict on the society. And one of the things that I could talk about is that in visiting these areas, this is a conflict that's a lot bloodier, I think, than people in this country realize in terms of the media that you get. I mean, when you go to a casualty collection point in a conflict where you've got heavy artillery and that much metal that's flying through the air, it's something that's very different than warfare, where you have to worry about IEDs and that kind of stuff. Not to minimize those threats, but it's just simply to outline the extent to which this is a very different war than what was being prepared for. It's also a conflict where I switched it off on my phone. The air attack alerts and this sort of thing. The extent to which it's present in everyday people's lives every single day. And so it's something that is increasingly defining the country and its experience. So what I give you, I said there'd be some empirics, I'll give you a little bit of report from the ground. This is, I don't know, I got a chunk of my website, gyms of the world. Those things are heavy, so in a pinch, you can do some curls with them. And this is the battlefield reality. It's a Russian and Ukrainian defense in depth, and this is a context which is fundamental to this attrition warfare. Mind you, keep that thought in your brain about security force assistance. That when we were in Germany, beginning in December of last year, a lot of attention to maneuvers, but Ukrainians being a little bit unsettled about this because they're saying that's not the war that we're seeing coming up. Part of their problem is they have a difficult time articulating that because they need the stuff. So they don't want to tell the provider maybe the reality of what's going on. This is part of what our job is to try to figure out sort of what that disconnect is and to maybe write stuff that might move the needle a little bit. So our perception was that U.S. and NATO trainers are not, and I think to some extent still not appreciating Ukraine's current situation, although I think that's becoming more apparent. And this is just simply the platform and collective training of Ukrainians that's for this concept of combined arms maneuvers. So for those of you got put the training wheels on a little bit, what's combined arms maneuver, and this is the sort of thing that we're talking about definition. You got to go to the joint publications or doctrinal publications, and it's this idea that I think is very satisfying to us psychologically. It's something that I think of Joe Mani, if any of you have heard of that person. When I'm thinking about what sort of the concept of warfighting combined arms maneuvers would be, and it's the idea that if you punch the adversary in the face, if you could do something that's very sudden and violent and shocking, that what it does is it creates this confusion, it creates this turmoil, and the adversary rapidly disintegrates. This in Ukraine, I think, is partly a consequence of sort of this thinking, this application to Ukraine. It's a consequence of the 3-day war. And that is that when Russia stepped up the invasion. You know, Russia first invaded Ukraine in 2014, something that's very important in terms of sort of how that military in Ukraine's organized and the way that Ukrainians fight. But I think for outsiders, for a lot of people who do the planning and designing of this stuff in the United States, the war starts in February of 2022, and there was this sort of shock at the poor performance of the Russian military. It's the idea that, you know, all these reforms of the Russians, you know, that stuff wasn't really serious. So, you know, the Russian military is a paper tiger. So you saw a lot of reports in the media about how weak and how incompetent and how corrupt the Russian military is. That was deceptive. That was misleading because Russia's military, that was the 3-day war. Like, they didn't think that they were going to fight a long war. So what they did was they sent folks out unprepared. So that's true. But that wasn't the real Russian military. So that unpreparedness, I think, settled into the official mindset about what Russia's military actually is. What we see now is, you know, now they're on the A game. It took a while for them to get there. And then there was also the period of the counteroffensive of the Ukrainians in the fall, which did take a lot of territory, which wasn't, you know, I wouldn't say that was combined arms, but what it did was it created an expectation of this continuing. So you see this sort of this attachment to this idea, and here's a guy who's, you know, always got some bright ideas and so forth. And, you know, he's telling us in June, at a time when I was in Ukraine, when I was in Eastern Ukraine, and that was not the situation in Eastern Ukraine at all. In fact, something very different had happened, which was the 47th Regiment in late May was attempting to punch through Russian lines. And this was supposed to be continuation of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And it was pretty apparent it wasn't working. And in fact, one of the suspicions was that the Ukrainians knew it wasn't going to work, but they had to do it because we gave them all that stuff and they need a whole bunch more stuff because it's a war that for them is 1,000 times worse than our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So they're desperate, and they, for political reasons, they got to make a demonstration to us that they're going to try our idea. But maybe I'm speaking too much from hindsight, but I'm also speaking from the field and from talking to Ukrainians and being with them there in that place and knowing that might not have been a good idea to do against the A-team and looking at the satellites and so forth at what was going on at that time. So I don't know, maybe I'm being too harsh because I think I've put a caveat. The platforms training, it's our earlier stuff. It was M119s and 777s and stuff like that. Totally professional, totally proficient in terms of the equipment training that they're getting. But I would say, you know, part of the flaw in this plan is the big bosses, that there's that implicit idea. Maybe I'm taking McMaster's concept of strategic narcissism. I'm stretching it a little bit here. But I think that the underlying flaw was that the U.S. Army, the JMTGU and the folks in Wiesbaden and Germany, that they're not training for the reality of what's going on. What they're doing is they're training Ukraine's military for what we do best. I think there's a problem with that, not just for the Ukrainians, but the assumption, it's the classic assumption, well, what we're going to do is we're going to prepare for the next war on the basis of what we did really well in the last war. You have to do that, but you also might have to prepare for other wars. And I think that Ukraine's a cautionary tale in this, and something that should be studied as an example of what 21st century attrition warfare looks like and the potential that this is something that we may face in the future. So limited progress in the summer counteroffensive. This is 47th Regiment, the folks that lost all the Bradleys and so forth. And here's the setup. When you look at it tactically, they're punching through the first Russian lines. What's happening is that when you look at the Russian defensive positions here, there are lots of lines. So in that period of time, when the A-team, the Russian A-team comes into play, and they're having a chance to dig in, and Ukrainians are going through this training, that battlefield is changing. The fundamental character of that battlefield is changing. So you punch through and you slow down, and the problem is that, once you slow down in that sort of hardening concrete through the first line, then it starts closing in around you. So you've lost that momentum, and this is the story of 47th Regiment and so forth, which was supposed to be the vanguard of these Western-trained Ukrainian soldiers. But it was the wrong battlefield. You can see the larger strategy, try to cut through to the coast here about 100 kilometers, divide the Russian forces. But looking at the blue and the red on that map, that's not happening. When I was there in the early part of the summer, this was a battle of 100 meters at a time, 200 meters at a time. And you talk to the Ukrainians, and you're like, well, that's a long way to that coast. And the other problem is that once you do bust through a line, you're doing it slowly. So what they do is they put another line in. So once you've cleared some territory, there's a whole bunch more territory for you to clear. If you're going slow, what's happening too is new mines are getting filled in behind you, around you. Just sort of in the anecdote part of this, thinking about what this place looks like, there are a lot of landmines all over the place. The drive from Kramatorsk to Kharkiv for 50 kilometers, there's no farming. This is all minefields around there, just millions and millions of mines. Mines that are stacked. Mines that are set and arranged in ways to try to blow up armor that isn't supposed to be blown up by landmines, to disrupt mine clearance and so forth. So one of the most dangerous jobs is engineers. You got to clear the mines in order to move forward, and so this is the defensive situation. This is the reality of attrition warfare. So when you look at this context, continuous defense in depth, then you see this problem here, the layers of defensive positions and the difficulty of breaking through those in any kind of expeditious order. So this is the war that is, and it's a war of small arms. It's oh dear, got the incriminating T-shirt on. Anyway, and so here's the report. It's a lot of heavy artillery forces, and in a nutshell, so I'm not hitting it right. Here's a lesson about the character of warfare. It looks a lot like World War I, this idea of attrition warfare, this balance between the two sides. But here's the 21st century aspect of it, is that you've got the technology of today where you've got very good ISR. You got, good information about what's going on the ground. What the different positions are. And these are the developments and refinement of satellite drones, etc. So both sides are able to see what the other sides are doing pretty well. And the problem with being able to see and being able to target effectively is that both sides, you can't concentrate a lot of people together. So right now, or recently, there was an event where it was a field ceremony, the awarding of medals to about 20 Ukrainian soldiers, and boom, Russian missile lands on that spot. I mean, so that got reported in the media, but looking across this whole battle space here, the problem is if you have more than 12 soldiers together, it becomes a target. And if you can't mass more than 12, like, how are you going to get that larger mass in order to conduct maneuvers? So what it looks like is sort of like this. It's like, light artillery, small mortar teams, just a few guys, small enough and defensive position enough that even if they are targeted, they're going to be able to survive. So the plan then is spread your forces out real thin across what the Ukrainians call the red zone, sort of the active combat zone. And what's happening with very rapid development of drone technology, and here you've got point counterpoint, new development, new electronic warfare development to defeat the advantage of that development, new innovation, and so forth. So what that's doing is it's increasing the mutual capacities of drone warfare on both sides, and it's expanding that red zone. So that active combat zone's getting deeper and deeper, and you have that stalemate between positions. So you have to adapt. So if I'm describing maneuvers in Ukrainian warfare, it's basically at the platoon level or below. And organizationally, this part of our study, what we're really interested in is, what kind of impact this has in terms of the Ukrainian military that is being created, is that along with this is a decentralization of a decision-making process. I don't know whether it's sort of a creation of an NCO corps, or a solid NCO corps in a distinctly Ukrainian context, a sort of Ukrainification of this kind of process. And one of the questions remaining for us is to what extent is this being integrated into the overall structure of Ukraine's military, and who are these people to whom decisions are being decentralized? So effectively what's happening is that sort of what I would see as a functional NCO corps. It's a combination of officers who are more out in the fight, the ones that are surviving, and then also the smart and charismatic, regular guys that are out there fighting who gain the respect and the authority that comes with that. So it's organizational adaptation on the ground. What's going on in the bigger picture? Attrition warfare. What you have to do is, in order to keep the other side from breaking out, applying pressure across the lines, not necessarily to take territory, but to occupy them. And in the battle of attrition, sort of the second best, could be the battery, is, pressure the Russian forces, make sure that they can't mass their troops. I think okay, here we go. I don't know, destroy Russian artillery, hopefully. But all kinds of tactics to try to get the Russians to use ammunition. I guess the bad news is North Korea is like a big munitions factory, so they get some more. I mean, I'm kind of surprised, 152 millimeter. I thought all this Soviet-style stuff was all going to get used up long after I'm dead because there's so much of it. But now we see them all burning through all the Soviet supplies. But And then the other, and I think this is what's important in terms of the Ukrainian military strategy, is try to use drone technology, other technologies to inflict casualties on Russian forces that has a political effect. So inflict casualties at favorable rates. So there's a lot of debate about how many Russians are killed for how many Ukrainians are killed. It might be 1 to 3. Part of the bad news is that Russia's about 3.5 times larger than Ukraine, so who's going to run out fast? But, in attrition warfare, usually how do these things end? It's when one side's army gets broken. One way to break them is the will to fight. My suggestion with the weather today is that, I'm going to go back to Ukraine soon. I'm going to take a whole bunch of really good winter gear. I think use the weather. If Russian forces are less motivated, the invading, conquering forces, they might be a little less motivated than the people who are fighting for their homes. Use that weather. Use that weather to demoralize and confuse those Russians and shift that casualty balance into a direction that's more favorable for Ukrainians. But that, again, this message about what kind of war it is a bloody, bloody fight. It is a very different kind of war, I think, that American soldiers have experienced since at least 1951-53 Korean War. And Americans had air power. And these Ukrainians and Russians are fighting. It's not that aircraft are completely absent from the sky, but again, the development of technology and the way that influences the character of the battlefield, that it at least at the contact line, its space is very dangerous for aircraft on both sides. So what you hear in the sky is buzzes, not the rotors. I teach a lot of military history to my students because I think that there are a lot of lessons in military history. This guy, General John Monash, he's a hero in Australia. I think he's on the money. I can't remember if he's on the 50 or 100, I think it is. They don't have Benjamins, they got Monashes. And he's somebody who's worth studying because he's a person who was clever in the context of attrition warfare in World War I. And this is a similar defense in depth that, multiple defensive lines on both sides, German and Allied. And Monash sort of had this idea that's, I think, very current, and Ukrainians refer to him about, the trick being that that rate of attrition, that you have to kill enough of their side, the other side, that it has a political effect and it undermines their will to fight, the cohesion of their armed forces. Because you don't want to fight to the last person. You got to get them to break first. So part of his strategy, Monash's strategy, was exploit the thinly defended forward lines, not so much to take the territory, but what you want to do is what I just showed you in the earlier pictures there, the earlier slides, and that is try to provoke your adversary into responsive maneuvers that exhaust them. Do stuff that forces them to respond. So the initiative isn't combined arms maneuvers, sort of what the training was saying, but rather this kind of adaptation, like John Monash's adaptation on the Western Front. And again, this is something I think that reinforces this organizational change in Ukraine's armed forces, and that's that company and platoon level, that decentralization of decision making. What's fascinating is to see a Soviet legacy military that's changing so fast. And back to the larger question, the stuff that, the incredibly exciting paper that was the read ahead, that's the type of stuff that I think is the political element that the people who do all of this security force assistance, designing in the United States and NATO and so forth, this is a political element that they need to pay attention to. To look at that political, that organizational context in which these resources are being used. One of the other things that I find important and interesting is that in terms of putting these tactics together in sort of an overall military strategy is the extent to which it's also a project, here's the anthropological part of it, a project of what I would see as a particular echelon in Ukraine's military, and these are Ukrainians who served in Afghanistan. And it's not so important that they were in Afghanistan fighting the Taliban. What they were doing in Afghanistan was they were developing like a BROCOM, a bro command of Eastern European militaries that were in Afghanistan as part of a NATO effort, but were getting to know each other and to talk to each other about a common problem, which was the Russians. Because remember, the Russians invaded Ukraine beginning in 2014, and they conquered a part of Ukraine's territory, Crimea, and they invaded Georgia Republic in 2008. So these are folks who think that they have to help their Ukrainian brothers so they don't have to fight Russians. And that is a network of innovation, exchange of information, of influence and so forth in Eastern European capitals that I think is important in terms of sort of how Ukraine's military changes and also the way that they think about this campaign. And, it goes back earlier also, I think, Ukrainians' participation in KFOR, peacekeeping operation in Kosovo and so forth. So here's an unanticipated consequence of some earlier programs. When Ukrainians showed up in Afghanistan, we didn't think like, oh, well, that's nice. Our little brothers from former Soviet Union are helping us out. But what they were doing was they were using that program to help themselves out, I think, in a way that wasn't necessarily anticipated. And another interesting aside, this is the type of stuff I'm interested in, just the way that I study things. In October of 21, after the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, there were some very audacious flights from Ukraine to Afghanistan to go pick up people who were left behind. And they didn't knock on the door when they arrived in Afghanistan. They arrived in force, and they told the Taliban government who they wanted and gave them a list. First list was color-coded. Gave it to the Afghans. What is this pornography? And so they had to print it out again in black and white. But they got this stuff. Part of what that was an exercise in cooperation. They wanted to get the people in Afghanistan, but they were doing an audacious thing together in partnership with some folks in the Baltic states and from Poland who are in important decision-making capacities now. A theory of victory, I wish I had a better one. This is a famous painting that's in the St. Petersburg Russian State Museum. These are Ukrainians telling the Ottoman Sultan, no thank you. They do not want his protection. Obvious metaphor for today. It's a theory of foreign support, mindful of the last attempt to remake a foreign army in the U.S.'s image. That very expensive army in Afghanistan, remember that? There's also the Iraq one before ISIS. This is part of the motivation to study what actually is happening in Ukraine, to better understand how to design these programs, and in designing them, who to talk to inside Ukraine. I think Ukraine's got an interesting sense of humor. This is Ukraine's parliament sort of redoing. They're writing a letter to the Russian Sultan and telling him, no thanks, we don't want your protection. I'll go quickly through this part. Innovation. This is Krapiva. This is kind of old news now. One of the interesting things about Ukraine is it was back office IT for a lot of European firms, close to Europe. A lot of connections, but a lot less expensive labor market. So at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, you have a lot of Ukrainians that they're punching above their weight class in terms of global IT. The other thing too is they're connected to a lot of people who are not Ukrainian, who are in IT sector, who want to help Ukraine. This is asymmetric. This is an advantage that Ukrainians have that Russians don't have in terms of the development of technologies that can change that situation on that attrition battlefield. So this has been particularly important in the integration of drones in warfare in Ukraine. I don't know, other things, you got Elon Musk factor and who knows what's going on there. The integration of Starlink and so forth. One problem with Starlink, that thing sucks up a lot of energy. So if you're going to use that, you got to take a lot of batteries. So this is, in a sense, I wouldn't call them maneuvers, but this is the Ukrainified communication on the battlefield, which you see that lesson from this conflict, the role that technology plays and what kind of military organization you have on that battlefield. Character of warfare changing a lot. I'd say the nature of it, that's pretty old-fashioned, and that's very observable in Ukraine as well. The role of volunteers of civil society, there was sort of a thing that open societies are more vulnerable to pressure from authoritarian regimes, just because there are more points of contact, less defended. I think that one of the theoretical lessons of this conflict in Ukraine is that this open society concept, that in fighting against Russian invasion is something that has some comparative advantages that Russian society does not have, particularly in the application of technologies, IT, to increasing combat power. I mean, Russia's got great STEM education. It's got a strong IT sector. But one of the questions in this conflict is to what extent does that sort of more networked aspect, and particularly the internationalized aspect of Ukraine's IT sector, is that going to be decisive on the battlefield in terms of increasing the capabilities and the power? And then the other social factor, just this organizational adaptation that I've talked about on the battlefield. I'm assuming that most of you are here because you do care a little bit about this kind of stuff, but I'll give you some reasons. Maybe it's too political, but why you should care. And that is, the pitch that we make, that our team makes when we're writing, is that assistance to this effort's actually important, whether you care about Ukraine or not. You look at it and you see all those dollars that are going to Ukraine, and you wonder why. I see homeless people on the street. Why aren't we spending money on our own people? But Ukraine's about more than Ukraine. It's about an international system that came at great blood and other costs to the United States and its partners back in that period before 1945. And part of that idea is that conquest doesn't pay, that it's a much safer world if you have a strong global norm against the forcible occupation of another country's territory, and in this case, particularly the use of nuclear threats against a weaker country in order to take its territory or to take its sovereignty away from us. Because I'm thinking about another place where you've got a country that another country thinks it's a part of that country. Like, wait a minute, how'd that part of our country get away from us? I'm thinking about Taiwan. sort of Putin's speech before the full-scale invasion that Ukrainians don't exist because they're actually Russians. They just don't know it. You know, sort of that argument that Taiwanese are, yeah, they speak Chinese, but they're like Chinese like us in Beijing, but they just don't know it. I think that it's a really good idea to avoid that outcome where you get woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning because something's happening now in the Western Pacific. And you can think about this in simulations in class. Okay, what do you do? What's your first response? How's that going to unfold? Well, one option is you do nothing. I mean, that's an option. Well, what are the consequences of that? All you're going to get out of that is a bunch of really tough, really bad decisions. So one way of avoiding that outcome is do something about a country that invaded the territory of another country and made some nuclear threats, and show that conquest ain't a thing. That runs into some trouble in other parts of the world too. And we'll get into that. All right, but we'll get some scenarios. I don't know if I have any happy scenarios, but you know, we can do a poll, try to figure out which one's the most likely. But I'm running out of time, so I think I'll just end it there and see what you all have to say and field any questions that you may have.
Okay. Between your paper and the talk, you put a lot of interesting, maybe provocative points
totally have that
on the table. We have a great turnout, especially of students, and we'd love to have some of our students kick off the discussion. You know, the faculty will always talk, but if you don't want to hear the faculty talk, you hear them talk the whole semester. You've got to grab the bull by the horns. So the list is open. Who has a question or comment for Professor Reno? Please.
Hey, good afternoon, Professor. Oh, there we go. Brittany Portal. Have some first year PhD here at Notre Dame. From what are the Ukrainians' realistic kind of best case scenario, or do they have a optimism? Like, are they seeing like a Korea outcome, or are they seeing something more advantageous?
There are a lot of things going on. I mean, right now it grinds on and on. So Ukrainians see that, and they have to prepare for that. But they're also very aware of the fact, I think, at the level of political leadership, that this is unsustainable. They look at electoral cycles in the West. They look particularly at the United States, and I think, to put it succinctly, they're very aware of the fact that Ukraine will be the first stop in the revenge tour if Donald Trump's elected. Game over. So they have to prepare for the withdrawal of Western assistance. I wouldn't call it resistance under occupation. I think that would be a very bad outcome, because it will, ending Western assistance, it's like we already kind of bought into it. But if you back out of it, now that Ukrainians have built up the capacity that they have, what it's going to do is it's going to create a much more intense war in Eastern Europe. And it's going to create a dilemma for Eastern European countries within NATO, as NATO members. To what extent are they going to step up assistance? See, and the problem then is looking at it in the larger context. To a perspective in Russia, this looks like escalation. It looks like escalation by actors that could be more easily intimidated, which is an invitation to Russian escalation. So I think it is a kind of dangerous situation, because what we have now is we have a war, in some respects, a proxy war between nuclear armed powers, and that's the next part of this talk, which we don't have time for, is what security force assistance and sort of what the incentive structure and logic of that looks like when you have the nuclear question. And you have recipients that exercise real military capacity. I think that there's an incentive on the part of the Ukrainians to do things to drag us deeper into the conflict against our will. I think they've been very aware of some of the dangers of that, but I think if they become more desperate, they may try to do such things. In other words, force our hand. I do not see, I mean, when I come back to the U.S., I always get asked the question, what about their will to fight? And I say they're very tired. I ask my Ukrainian friends that question because other people ask me that question. And what they say is, we have no other choice. And this is a strategic mistake of Russian forces early in the conflict, the atrocities against civilians, the mass graves in, broken cities like Izum. It's just terrible. And they don't have a choice because they know what will happen to military-age males in a government in Ukraine that's controlled by Russia. And that's it. So they say death is a better path. So they will fight to the end. I think many of them will. The other thing, too, is you attack a country, that's a good way to strengthen that country's national identity. Oh, boy, the strategic miscalculation on Moscow's part. Maybe there'll be collapse in Russia. Part of the trip to Ukraine was being able to watch the whole Prigozhin thing from outside Kramatorsk. Whoa, that was weird even for Russian politics. That showed a crack. There's a crack there. And that's back to the attrition strategy that if they can't punch the big bear in the face, what they can do is they can increase some pressures that might ripple through Russian society and through its elite. Thanks. Bo?
Hi, Bo Simpson. I'm a fellow here with Mike's program, also in the Marine Corps. Thanks for doing your field work and bringing your information to us. We're very interested. So you spoke of battlefield transparency as being a main factor in why, we've reverted, our maneuver capabilities are gone and Ukraine's reverted to World War I style warfare. The Germans in World War I were able to spark some maneuver warfare with the advent of their rifle squad and stormtroop tactics. Are you seeing any similar innovations in Ukraine, hyper-enabling their squads, EW and drones?
I don't see it in terms of effects on the ground. Okay. I think that both sides are aware of the risks of maneuvers. So the analogy would be February 1918, Germans punching through Allied lines. So you get significant advances, but it's that problem of defense in depth, which means that army, it moves forward, but then there are multiple points of attack on its flanks. So, did that destroy Germany's army? You have that initial success, and I think that for the Ukrainians, some of whom I've talked to who do make that analogy about the initial attempts in late May and early June, that on a smaller scale, that's kind of what happened to this 47th Regiment, where they thought that they were doing it right. It looked like they were doing it right to them. But then as they're slowing down, they're seeing that territory that they took, that they can't hold it. And, moreover, that they're going to lose a lot of their own force in the process even of retreating. So that's a tough one for a commander, I think, because you want to do that. Politically, sort of, morale and so forth, you want to show that you can do that. but the initial success, it might be an illusion. But will it? Well, I don't know. That's what they pay the folks the big bucks to do. I just get to sit there and ask the question. But I think that is a hard one for them. I think it is like Germany and German offensive in February of 1918. And then that's what I think broke the back of the German army. Although, of course, they learned the lesson, and then it was different in 1939, right? Different technology, too. Yes, please.
Sir, Mitch Cuccinata. So we had forces there before the invasion, or this newer invasion. So one question, I guess, is how are we missing the security force assistance of that road communication, like you said? And then do you think teaching combined arms at like an American style instead of like anything they need to be focusing on Soviet style of doctrine, since that's probably what they're...
No, I don't think they should be focusing on Soviet style. I think that for the folks that were trained by Americans in Yaroviv before February of last year, what they found the most useful is 10th group training, and it's resistance under occupation. So they didn't get occupied, or at least most of them didn't get occupied. But what it was the sort of small group tactics that, when you put it into that type of battlefield, were useful. I think there was some residual usefulness in terms of there's a reach back capability to the people, or at least the organizations that were providing that training. So yeah, the training was effective. What is interesting about it is the way in which Ukrainians repurposed it. So I think that cycling back and the work that we do when we try to bring this back to the trainers is to say, look at what you did. Now, be conscious about that, be purposeful about that, and figure out, what are the multiple effects of that? There's the other question about the BROCOM, and yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's the type of thing that individuals see, but in a big bureaucracy like our Defense Department, individuals can see problems, identify all kinds of problems, but go try telling the boss that there's a problem. I mean, do you want to have a happy life? Do you want to have a happy career? I mean, you can give that information, but it's very difficult to have the system change. I mean, like one of the problems that we saw, I mean, here's that organizational anecdote, is that on platforms training, that 101st Division, it's like stationed in Europe. Hey guys, can you shift some artillery over here? Help us out. With training Ukrainians, because JTM, GTU, I mean, they have to borrow organizationally. So you'll get individual commanders. They'll be like, yeah, go team Ukraine. We really want the Ukrainians to be successful, but it's like, arm orders? No, wait, readiness. We need that stuff because, we need to make sure that our troops are ready. Well, what's readiness? I mean, that's an evaluation. I mean, it's a thing, but you also have to certify that you did it, that you have, that, things are where they're supposed to be, folks are ready to do things. So you would get that organizational logic that's saying, don't do that, whereas the individual's head is saying, yeah, that's what we should do. See, and I think that this is one of the things that's really hard to break. Like our whole authorizations system for security force assistance, I mean, it goes back to a series of reforms, but, when it takes 3 years to do an authorization in a lot of cases, not all cases, but in a lot of significant cases, that's not the tempo that, the real world works. And that's a tempo that we could afford for 3 decades when we were the top dog, because if we failed, it didn't really matter. Now it actually matters because we have competition. And that type of institutional change, that type of procedural change is, I mean, again, this is another reason sort of why we write, is because, you know, that's an important question that should be on the political agenda in this country.
Thanks. Dan Lin?
Yeah. Overall, my question is about how you assess nuclear stability in the Ukraine situation. And I ask that because of this quote from your piece. Although Putin defined the expansion of the infrastructure of the NATO-led alliance and military development of territories of Ukraine that has begun is unacceptable to us. In our own historical territories, an anti-Russia hostile to us is being created. This is a real threat, not just to our interests, but to the very existence of our state, its sovereignty. And when you read Russian nuclear doctrine, that is one of the conditions under which they'd use nuclear weapons.
That's right.
Their state is threatened. So what do you think?
This is why it's a dangerous situation. I mean, in some respects, maybe by supporting the Ukrainians, we're already in a trap. I mean, if it was a 3-day war, and it was a close thing. I mean, the Russians were pretty close. It could have just been, you know, that's tragic. Here's an area of Russian influence. What we're dealing with right now is something that's different than the Cold War balance, nuclear balance, because we're contesting a zone of core strategic interests. It's not being defined as totally core in U.S. and NATO, but it's pretty important because it has implications for the cohesion of the NATO alliance if the effort fails. So that's pretty core. I think it's reasonable to see why in Moscow they would see it as a zone of, you know, sort of their core strategic interests, because it was part of the former Soviet Union and all of the cultural and personal affinities and so forth. You know, during the Cold War, when we contested, it was always on the periphery. You know, it was civil wars in the old third world in which, you know, you back a proxy against the other side's proxy and battle for influence there. Not safe to battle for influence in places like Berlin or in Cuba. But we're basically doing that now. I mean, I think an analogy would be, you know, what if NATO came to the assistance in 1956 to protesters in Budapest, or in 1968 in Czechoslovakia? Like, you could see where the Soviet Union, they'd be like, yeah, that's a pretty direct threat. So I think that in general, you know, there have been a series of nuclear threats in this war. I think that Moscow's behaved in a very logical fashion, in a very predictable fashion. You know, maybe they've kind of cheapened the threats. But that's an issue too, because if we become complacent that there are no red lines, I mean, I can understand why the Biden administration's pretty cautious about this kind of stuff. I mean, it would keep me up at night. Because, you know, maybe there are no red lines until there is a red line. And what happens if there is a nuclear detonation? Like, what do you do in the simulation? What's your next move? I mean, what the Biden administration, at least what I read in the media, says is that, yes, that will elicit a harsh response, and that harsh response would take the form of possibly an attack on the base inside of Russia, where that original nuclear attack was initiated, or an attack or enabling the Ukrainians to launch a devastating attack against Russian forces inside occupied areas in Ukraine. Well, what does Moscow do? You know, they got to respond to that. You see, here's the problem of the ladder of escalation. And at what point is that controlled? I mean, in the end of this, we don't want to all blow ourselves up. And here is another disjuncture in terms of interests. So visiting Polish War College, and having this debate, and they're like, no, you guys have to give everything. Why is that? Because you have to help them kill as many Russians as possible so that they don't come and invade Poland or try to leverage Poland. And I'm like, do you want us to all get blown up? And they're like, that's your problem. It's like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. You see, so I would become concerned about, I mean, I love my Ukrainian brothers, but my concern is that the danger capability is that their threshold of risk is a lot higher because they see that they're potentially going to lose a lot more, in a war that's 1,000 times worse than our recent wars. So yeah, of course they'll take it. They'll have much more tolerance for risk. But sort of like the Polish officers were saying to me, it's like, yeah, well, you're the superpower. You're the one that has to worry about it. You'll protect us. I don't necessarily like that answer.
Me neither. Mr. Nagel, let's see if we can get a better answer out of it.
I'm Edward. I'm an undergraduate in the NDISC program. Thank you for a great talk, Dr. Reno. I guess one thing I found interesting in the talk was your discussion of the problems of U.S. security force assistance and how U.S. security forces basically weren't prepared for the nature of this war. So I guess the question I have is thinking about other U.S. security commitments around the globe. To what extent would that be a problem if the U.S. were to, say, defend Taiwan, or if there was a development on the Korean Peninsula? Then also, how does that affect U.S. deterrence if, are our adversaries seeing the problems with U.S. security force assistance, and then, does that lead them to try and capitalize on that and kind of encourage them to take up offense because they know that U.S. security force assistance isn't able to adapt that way?
It's a lot of questions, actually. I mean, and I interpret it as a lot of questions because I don't want to depress people too much, but I think each case is different. But to make a sort of a general response, I would say that security force assistance was mismatched to the task, habitually mismatched to the task during the period up to the late 2010s because it didn't matter. So in other words, we could do it kind of for the hell of it because we want to do it or we think it helps a little bit. We have problems of measuring it. We can see it's not working, but we keep doing it. People's careers depended on it. There's a whole infrastructure for it. So I think that's part of it. And, there were genuine positive effects and so forth. But in a benign strategic environment, failure is permissible. The problem now is that in at least some places, failure has much more serious consequences. This is the problem of institutional adaptation in the United States. How do we change a system that has been designed around, let's say, less than optimal outcomes to something that is much more adaptive and realistic about its application? And I think then that begins a whole discussion about military advising and about military to military relationships. There are a lot of Cold War lessons. There are also a lot of Cold War problems in that I think are cautionary tales about how to do that sort of thing. I think one of the challenges in our force is providing attractive professional pathways to do that sort of thing in a system that does not necessarily encourage regional specialization. Because I think that getting that type of knowledge requires, long-term continuity in terms of institutional and in terms of personal context. So I would love to see a system in which advising became much more attractive and I got all kinds of ideas about how I would do that, but like I say, that would be a different seminar. Harris.
Hi, my name is Harris. I'm a PhD student here. I'm just curious as to, well, right now I'm going for, because there's some serious issues, the current relationship between political and military leadership in Ukraine as to both the current position conflict and how it's going to turn out, and how we presume that it's going to be continuing this status of attrition warfare for the immediate future, how that will develop, will become more afraid because of the divergence in what the political and the military leadership actually want.
That begins to range out of my area of expertise. What I can say about it is that my expectation, given what I'm able to see in media and pick up from people that I do have contact and my experiences in Ukraine, is that it would be very surprising if there was not tension between the political leadership and military, and I would also include the intelligence services in Ukraine. And it's that things look very kind of unitary actor now, I think, from a distance. But as the military gains proficiency and the security services, which were rebuilt in a fashion that was much more cohesive and insulated from the rest of Ukraine's government, it would be shocking if these organizations did not develop their own interests and that these interests would come into conflict with the political leadership. Kate?
I'm Kate Brewer. I'm an undergrad in NDISC. I can't help but wondering, given Ukraine's close ties to Russia being part of the former Soviet Union, you can imagine that many Ukrainians have Russian family members, and vice versa. If there's Ukrainians that are a very small group that possibly sympathize with Russia, or Russians that sympathize with Ukraine in a sense, and maybe identify more with one country, and like if that's the case in Ukraine, what kind of threat might that pose if you have a small group of people in Ukraine who sympathize more with the Russian cause than their own?
I mean, Russia has millions of ethnic Ukrainians. I mean, here's a great case of the social construction of identity. I think in Eastern Ukraine, a lot of Russian speakers were politically Russian. A bunch of Russian soldiers show up in their town, their city, and mess it up. So they're Russian speakers, they become politically Ukrainian because nobody likes invaders. And that invader model looks like not a good model. The other problem for them was that they tended to be put in a sort of colonial type of relationship with Russian power because, you know, these were the people on the peripheries who get used as cannon fodder, the so-called People's Republics, Donetsk and Luhansk. They got a raw deal. They're Russian speakers. They're saying, you know, we're Russian. But a lot of them, you know, and their family members, they're like, who's going to protect us? That looks more like Ukraine. So you see that kind of shift. So when you say Ukrainians in Russia who, because they're ethnic Ukrainian, back Ukraine, it's more complicated than that, because I think a better way to look at it is to say maybe ethnically Ukrainian but politically Russian, or Russian speaking but politically Russian, or politically Ukrainian. So it becomes situational. I think that that said, for the Russian government, potentially it is a problem. It's a problem that this war against Ukraine is widening fractures in Russian society. And I would also point to the fact that one of the largest volunteer groups are Chechens inside Ukraine, because what they want to do is they want to fight a civil war, phase 2, well, it'd be 3.0 actually in Chechnya's case. And these are the people that were on the losing side. So the best way for them to do Chechen War 3.0 is to kill Russians in Ukraine and get stronger. You also see the radicalization of people from Belarus who were involved in a nonviolent pro-democracy movement up to election in 2020 that the guy who lost is still somehow president. They get radicalized. This is another big group of volunteers. So what they're doing is they're getting military experience fighting Russians and killing Russians because they want to go to Belarus and fight Russians and kill Russians and get rid of their dictator. So this is becoming a big problem for Russia, particularly when Russia takes ethnic minorities, other groups that might have less political power. They're the ones who somehow get mobilized and pushed out there in Ukraine. That's part of the reason for that asymmetry, I think, in the casualty rates between Ukrainians and Russians, is that Russia's got more people to throw at it. But throwing people at Ukrainians in this fashion, what it does is it creates this kind of political overdraft for the Russian government. So it can maintain legitimacy, it can maintain its popularity in the cities, in core areas that are dominated ethnically Russian, but you get these fractures out in these other places. So that's a complicated sort of political and social answer to that question. It's interesting, and I don't have information, but I would love to know more about the sabotage attacks inside Russia, which I think do have significant effects. There have been a series of them in the last week at defense production plants that attacks on their energy supplies. And these are attacks deep in Russia. So I would assume there has to be some sort of assistance. I may be wrong, but that's just an assumption on my part.
So I'm going to recognize the distinguished chair and talk a little bit about your paper and the challenges of training and military assistance. And a lot of the discussion focuses, not in the paper, but the public discussion of Ukraine is starting to focus on the supply side. And it makes me a little nervous because there's a stab in the back story that's coming out. And the bad stab in the back story is that the United States forced the Ukrainians to go on the offensive too early, and we sold them a bill of goods in maneuver warfare. Now, I think we didn't sell them a bill of goods in maneuver warfare, but I think they were willing buyers. Going all the way back to the beginning of U.S. assistance, after Crimea and during the Donbass War, two things were going on. One is, I think like most militaries, the Ukrainians want to be a first world military. And being a first world military means having Western stuff. And I think they'd have taken more of it if we had given it to it. Secondly, and relatedly, they had a political agenda. I don't think they were thinking militarily. I think they were thinking, we want to be part of NATO. The way to be part of NATO is to demonstrate that our military can operate at NATO standards, meaning you use NATO weapons. And thirdly, I think like the Poles, they wanted us to pull their chestnuts.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
You know more about this than I do, but I don't believe the Ukrainian military realized that the war would become what it was until they launched the offensives in the summer of 2023, and they started failing. I don't see much evidence that there were Ukrainian maverick military officers who were saying, no, this isn't going to work. We have a better way of fighting this war. And I think, in effect, they weren't even thinking about fighting the war. They were thinking about the symbolic elements of being a Western-style military and being part of NATO, and the operational stuff wasn't even part of the equation. Is that too cynical?
No, I mean, I think that there's a lot of stuff that was going on at the time. I mean, part of this is an empirical question. That is that, I mean, I can look in hindsight and I can say, here's what this battlefield looked like. And I can follow the order of battle and, you know, look at what was going on the ground. And I would say, okay, look, here's the satellite imagery. You guys, what did you think was going to happen? But what was actually happening for them at the time? Was it that they had been reassured by their successes 6 months prior, and they thought that they could repeat that? Did they think that a window of opportunity was closing so that Russia's military was not proficient in a way that it was becoming, and that now they had to act, so they gambled and they lost in that case? I don't think that the U.S. said, oh, you have to do this, otherwise, you know, we're going to do bad things to you or anything like that. But I do think that there was a Ukrainian anxiety about performance, so that that may have caused some of them to take risks that they wouldn't have taken otherwise. So, yeah, it's, I mean, like I say, it's an empirical question. It'd be interesting to go back and interview people. You know, there are people like Liam Collins and John Spencer that are studying the Battle of Hostomel, you know, going and interviewing people on all, not talking to the Russians, but, you know, talking to other folks and so forth to try to map out what was going on, what was the decision process at the time. But I think that you raised a lot of interesting questions.
Anybody else want to raise some interesting questions? Gee.
I'm just curious. You portray at the end of your talk, we'll always ask if Trump is elected because he'll cut off the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are afraid of that because if the Ukrainians get cut off, they're going to collapse. The war will spread to the rest of NATO. All that.
Well, they'll start doing rash things.
So, I wonder why you think that's true, given that in your talk and in the questions, everything the United States has offered to Ukraine has had negative repercussions for the Ukrainians. Like, we have encouraged the Ukrainians to get themselves killed. We've offered them the wrong training, equipment that's useless for this fight. The fight all takes place at the small unit level with small arms, none of which were provided. Like, who cares if our terrible assistance gets cut off? The Ukrainians could even be better off without us, not worse off. So it must be that you think that somewhere in there we're actually doing some good. And I wonder if you talk about that.
Oh, there's a lot of good. I mean, but it's goodness that happens through repurposing and innovation. So it's like the resources, the training. I mean, like when I look at the professionalism of platform training, like this is really good. Now, what do Ukrainians do with it? They go into battlefield. It's a very different kind of battlefield than to what I think the trainers were expecting that they were training for. But they're still taking this stuff and you know, they're performing in ways that increase their capacity, that allow them to fend off the Russians. I mean, in my story, what's going on is that the Ukrainians have a lot of agency in this. I mean, you know, we're giving them stuff that can get themselves killed, but they're choosing to use the stuff and get killed because they think that they're fighting for something that is worth risking death. What we have to decide is whether the stuff that we're giving to them and them getting killed is worth it to us. Like, what are our national interests in this? I mean, I think that sort of that's really what comes down to the question. I don't question Ukrainians' will to fight. And, you know, we're giving them all kinds of lethal stuff that kill Russians and to get other people, get themselves killed. So yeah, in that sense, we're making it worse, but we're riding on that train with them. On the Trump thing, I just take Trump at his word. I mean, he tends to do what he says. And he says that he'll take the United States out of NATO and that he'll cut off aid to Ukraine. And when I look at that, whatever way I think about Trump, yes, no, maybe, I think, what would the impact of a sudden security vacuum be when you have very well-armed Ukrainians who are fighting, who are going to be fighting against a larger adversary and are going to have a bunch of Eastern Europeans that are kind of worried about where all of this is going. And, maybe American stability in Europe was a good thing. But yeah, it's become hostage now to this war in Ukraine. I mean, maybe if you go back in time and say, February 25th, 2022, maybe it would have been better if the Russians had prevailed. I mean, it would be sad, but we would know what are the actual spheres of influence, and there's a stability, a cynical stability in knowing what's theirs and what's ours.
Do you want a quick follow-up, and we'll give Will the last word because we're approaching the witching hour?
Yeah, I'm curious. You said from even before your answer, like the Ukrainians want a lot of stuff from us, so they do crazy things to try to encourage us to get stuff. But what they're asking for, what we're giving them, Bradleys, they get shot to pieces. M1s, better off out of the fight than in the fight. Attackers, irrelevant to the fight you described. F-16s, what are they going to do with those?
Air defense.
Like, what are we doing? I just am not, like, what stuff do they want from us? Like, all the stuff they want is useless.
I don't think HIMARS is useless. What HIMARS has done is it's deepened that battlefield.
I mean, it's that forcing of concentration further and further from the contact line. And that's pretty significant. I think ATACMS, we gave them mini ATACMS, and they got some shadows from the British. That's disrupted Russian logistics. All of this stuff makes it harder for Russians to mass. And early in the conflict, in this phase of the conflict, the attacks on Russian officers, even Gerasimov apparently wounded and so forth. That was the old Soviet army. The boss has to go up front and tell people what to do. They can't do that anymore. Last New Year's, the HIMARS attack on the Christmas or the New Year's party of the Russians, killing several, 200 Russian soldiers. They can't get that many Russian soldiers together, even sort of in the rear echelon. So all of that stuff has effect. So all that stuff that we've given them has effect. What it has not done is it's not had the effect of Ukrainians proficiently taking territory, which is what we had come down to, and particularly the Ukrainians have come down to defining, like, what is victory? Like, what does success look like in this war? But if you look at what success is in a war of attrition, then it has had pretty significant effects. Oh, and what's their shopping list? Oh, don't get me started. Mini nuclear bombs. They're sorry they gave those things up. Should never give them up.
Okay, on that happy note, we're a little past witching hour, so it just remains to me to invite my colleagues to do a round of applause.